Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at how labor law works in the United States,
Okay.
especially for those of you listening out there who are trying to learn about this side of American English. I'm Thomas,
And I'm Linda.
and we've got a whole bunch of great material here, articles, research, even some really fun historical anecdotes that we're going to dig into.
Yeah, when we say we're going to deep dive, we mean it.
Yeah, we really do.
Labor law in this country has a very long and fascinating history.
It really does. And,
Yeah.
I was reading about some of the history, and it's kind of crazy. Some of the early attempts to suppress workers' rights, like back in 1677, there were cart drivers in New York getting fined for striking.
Wow.
Can you believe that? Or in 1746, you have carpenters. They're being treated like criminals for demanding better pay.
It's amazing when you think about how far things have come.
Yeah,
The concept of labor rights that we know today didn't really exist back then.
right.
A major turning point was the abolition of slavery during the Civil War. And that was really monumental in terms of recognizing the inherent dignity and rights of all workers.
So it's like the whole landscape of what it meant to be a worker in America was changing.
Absolutely.
And that evolution continues, right? You have things like the Sherman Antitrust Act
Mhm.
that was originally meant to prevent monopolies, but then it gets used against unions to try and limit their power.
Exactly. And then you see the pendulum swing back with the Clayton Act of 1914,
Okay.
which a lot of people call the Magna Carta of American labor, because it specifically said that the labor of a human being is not a commodity or an article of commerce.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, workers are people, not just cogs in a machine.
Right, not just a means to an end.
Right, exactly. And the idea that labor has inherent value beyond just its economic output,
Yeah.
that's been so influential in shaping later labor laws.
So this idea of freedom of association,
Mhm.
this right for workers to kind of band together and advocate for themselves, this is really important.
It's essential. It's protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that freedom of association extends to forming labor unions, and it's a cornerstone of a democratic society.
It's like giving workers a collective voice.
Exactly, to negotiate with those in power.
And there's that great Abraham Lincoln quote, I love it, about labor being superior to capital. It really drives home the point that without labor, there is no capital, no profit, no growth.
Right, and that brings us to kind of the bedrock of modern U.S. labor law, which is the National Labor Relations Act of 1935,
Okay.
the NLRA, we call it.
The NLRA, okay.
And this act codified some crucial rights for workers: the right to organize, the right to engage in collective bargaining, and even the right to strike.
Yeah. So striking is legal in the U.S. I think a lot of people might assume that that's not allowed.
It absolutely is a protected right, although there is a specific process that needs to be followed, and of course there are limitations, but the right to strike is a fundamental part of the NLRA.
Interesting. So we have this federal law that's protecting workers' rights, but then it gets more complicated, right? Because states can pass their own laws as well.
You're thinking of right to work laws, which have become a major point of contention in recent years.
Yeah.
Despite the name, these laws actually weaken unions by allowing employees to benefit from union negotiated contracts without having to pay union dues.
So it's a pretty controversial topic with strong arguments on both sides.
Definitely supporters of these laws. They'll argue that it's about freedom of choice for the worker, but opponents will say no, it undermines the ability of unions to effectively represent their members and bargain for better conditions.
So some pretty big consequences either way.
Right.
So we've talked about unions and this history of collective bargaining, but what about individual employee rights? What kind of protection does someone have just by being an employee in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a big question. And the U.S. labor law framework, it covers a lot of ground. Think of it like this, like your rights guide to navigating the American workplace. So some of the key areas are things like minimum wage, overtime, pay, family leave, safety regulations, and protection against discrimination.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit.
Yeah.
Minimum wage. So that's like the lowest amount an employer can legally pay someone per hour.
That's right. It ensures that workers are earning at least a basic level of income.
Okay, and what about overtime pay?
So overtime pay kicks in when you work more than 40 hours in a week.
Right.
And it's meant to compensate workers for putting in that extra time and effort.
So overtime, the dream of every overworked employee.
Exactly.
And family leave.
Yeah.
So this is time off from work that you can take to care for a new baby, a sick family member, or to deal with your own serious health condition.
Right. And it's not always paid, but it protects your job while you're away dealing with those situations.
So it's kind of like a safety net.
Mm-hmm.
What about safety regulations?
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing those weren't always a priority back in the day.
You're absolutely right. It took decades of struggle and activism to establish even basic safety standards in the workplace, you know.
Yeah.
A landmark achievement was the passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970.
Okay.
Or OSHA?
OSHA, isn't that the agency we hear about when there are workplace accidents or investigations?
That's right. They set and enforce safety and health standards that are designed to prevent injuries, illnesses, and fatalities on the job.
So they're like inspectors. They're going into workplaces and making sure companies are actually following these rules.
That's exactly right. They can issue citations, they can penalize companies for violations, and importantly, OSHA also protects workers who report safety concerns.
Oh, good. So there are some strong protections in place when it comes to worker safety in the U.S.
There are, although there are ongoing debates and challenges in terms of enforcement and, adapting to new industries and technologies. But OSHA has made a huge difference in improving working conditions for millions of Americans. Okay, so we've got minimum wage overtime, family leave, safety regulations. What about protection against discrimination?
That's another huge area of labor law, essentially. It means you can't be treated unfairly or denied opportunities based on certain characteristics like your race, your religion, gender, age, disability.
Okay, so employers can't just hire or fire someone because they don't like their religion or because they're over a certain age.
Nope. There are several major federal laws that prohibit discrimination in the workplace. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Pay Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So a lot of safeguards in place. But here's a question I was reading, that the U.S. doesn't have a federal law guaranteeing paid annual leave. Is that true?
It is true. It's one of the few developed countries without a national mandate for paid vacation time.
Wow. That's kind of surprising, especially for our listeners in Europe, where paid leave is often much more generous.
It's definitely a point of contrast. In the U.S., paid vacation time is largely left up to individual employers and collective bargaining agreements.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the history of workers' rights to the laws that shape the modern workplace today. What stands out to you in all of this? What's the one thing you think is most important for people to understand about how labor law works in the U.S.?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
You know what fascinates me most is this ongoing tension between the rights of workers and the interests of employers. It's this constant push and pull that has shaped the evolution of labor law in this country.
It's like this never-ending negotiation trying to find that sweet spot where both sides feel like they're heard and protected.
Exactly. And the landscape's always shifting, right? Reflecting changing societal values and economic realities.
It's a reminder that labor law isn't just some dusty old set of rules.
Right.
It's a living, breathing system that reflects who we are as a society and how we value work. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into U.S. labor law. We've explored the history of workers' rights, the key laws that shape the modern workplace, and some of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Now, for all of you out there who are learning English, we're going to switch gears a bit and focus on some of the vocabulary we've used today. We'll break down some key terms and phrases with examples to help you build your fluency and understanding of American English.
Stick with us. Okay, so let's dive into some of the vocabulary we've used so far.
Yeah. We've thrown around a lot of terms related to labor law, and I bet some of our listeners might be wondering, what exactly does all that mean?
Yeah, it can get pretty dense even for native English speakers.
Right. But understanding these key terms, it's really crucial if you want to grasp how labor law actually works in the U.S.
It is. So let's start with one of the most fundamental terms, labor union.
Okay, labor union. We've talked about unions a lot, but for those who might be unfamiliar, what exactly is a labor union?
Yeah, so a labor union is an organized group of workers who come together to try to improve their wages and working conditions.
Okay.
And they use their collective power to negotiate with employers. It's kind of like a team sport.
Okay.
You can also just say union for short. So, for example, you might hear someone say the teachers' union is fighting for smaller class sizes.
Right, so it's about strength in numbers.
Exactly.
And speaking of strength in numbers, what about collective bargaining? That's another phrase we've used a lot.
Collective bargaining is the process of negotiation between an employer and a union.
Okay.
That represents a group of employees. So think of it like a back and forth conversation where both sides are trying to reach an agreement on things like wages, benefits, working hours, safety procedures.
Okay.
So, for example, you might read in the news, the union and the company have been engaged in collective bargaining for weeks, but they still haven't reached a deal.
So it's like a formal way for workers to have a say in their workplace.
Exactly.
And sometimes those negotiations can get pretty intense.
Yeah.
Right?
They can, and sometimes if an agreement can't be reached, workers might decide to take more drastic measures like going on strike.
Okay, strike, that's a big one. What does it mean for workers to go on strike?
So a strike is a work stoppage
Okay.
that's organized by employees to put pressure on their employer during a labor dispute. It's a way for workers to show their collective power and demand better treatment.
Wow.
For example, you might hear on the news, thousands of nurses went on strike today demanding better pay and safer staffing levels.
So they're saying we're not working until you listen to our demands.
Exactly. And strikes can have a major impact on businesses and even the economy as a whole. They're a last resort, but they can be a really effective way for workers to get their voices heard.
So we've covered some big terms related to kind of this collective action.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears and talk about individual employee rights.
Yeah.
You know, one of the most important ones, especially for people just starting out in their careers, is minimum wage.
Right. The minimum wage is the lowest hourly wage an employer can legally pay an employee. And this ensures that workers are earning at least a basic level of income.
Right.
So you might hear someone say the minimum wage in the city is $15 per hour.
Which is a big deal, especially in places with a high cost of living. Now, what about overtime?
Overtime refers to that extra pay that an employee receives for working beyond their regular hours,
Okay.
typically 40 hours per week. And the idea is to compensate workers for putting in that extra time and effort.
Right.
So if you hear someone say, I've been working so much overtime lately, it means they've been putting in extra hours beyond their usual schedule.
Right. Which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the situation.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's nice to earn some extra cash.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like you're living at work.
Right. And another term that often comes up in conversations about work-life balance is family leave.
Okay, family leave.
So family leave is time off from work that you can take to care for a new baby, a sick family member, or deal with your own serious health condition. Now, it's not always paid, but it does protect your job while you're away.
Okay.
So, for example, you might hear someone say, I'm taking family leave to care for my aging parents.
Right. It's kind of a vital safety net for workers.
It is.
But I imagine the specifics of family leave laws probably vary from state to state here in the U.S.
They do vary quite a bit from state to state.
So it's a good idea to research your rights and know what your employer is required to provide.
Always a good idea to be informed. Now, let's talk about a term that is sadly relevant in many workplaces. Discrimination.
Ugh, discrimination, nobody wants to experience that. Can you explain what it means in the context of labor law?
Yeah, so discrimination in the workplace refers to the unfair or unequal treatment of an individual or a group based on certain characteristics, so things like race, gender, religion, age, disability.
Okay.
It's essentially treating someone differently because of who they are rather than their qualifications or their job performance.
So denying someone a promotion because of their race or paying a woman less than a man for doing the same job, that would be considered discrimination.
Exactly. It's illegal. It goes against the core principles of fairness and equal opportunity in the workplace.
Right. And the U.S. has, a whole bunch of laws designed to prevent discrimination. We talked about some of those earlier, like the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Right, exactly. Now, another term that we've been throwing around is right-to-work laws.
Okay.
But the name can be a little misleading, so it's important to understand what they actually mean.
Yeah, right to work sounds like a good thing. Like everyone has the right to work, which of course they do, but these laws are a little more nuanced than that.
They are essentially right-to-work laws. They allow employees in certain starts to benefit from union-negotiated contracts without having to pay union dues.
Okay.
And this can weaken unions because they have fewer resources to advocate for their members.
So it's a pretty controversial issue with strong arguments on both sides.
It is, some people will argue that it gives workers more freedom of choice,
Right.
while others say that it undermines the collective bargaining power of unions.
So it's complicated.
It's a complex debate for sure. Now, let's move on to a couple of terms that often come up in discussions about firing and job security. First up is termination.
Termination. So that's the formal way of saying someone's employment has ended.
Exactly. And it can be voluntary, meaning the employee chose to leave, or involuntary, meaning they were fired.
Okay. And speaking of fired, that's another term we should probably define.
You bet fired is just a more informal way to say that someone was involuntarily terminated from their job. It can be for a variety of reasons, poor performance misconduct, or even just a company downsizing.
And sometimes people get fired for no reason at all, right? Like in those at-will employment states.
That's right. In those states, an employer can generally fire someone for any reason or no reason at all, as long as it's not an illegal reason like discrimination.
Right. So it's good to know your rights as an employee.
It is. Now, one last term I want to touch on is just cause. And this refers to a legitimate or valid reason for taking an action, like terminating an employee.
Okay, so it's like having a good reason to fire someone, not just doing it on a whim.
Exactly. So, for example, if an employee steals from the company or violates a major company policy, that would likely be considered just cause for termination.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of vocabulary here, from labor unions to termination and everything in between.
We have.
Do you have any tips for our English language learners on how they can continue to improve their vocabulary and fluency?
I think the key is to make learning English a part of your daily routine.
Okay.
Don't just study grammar and vocabulary from textbooks. Immerse yourself in the language.
What do you mean by immerse yourself?
Watch English language movies and TV shows.
Okay.
Listen to music. Listen to podcasts. Read books and articles. The more you expose yourself to the language, the more natural it will become.
That's great advice. And don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Everyone makes mistakes when they're learning a new language. The important thing is to just keep practicing and keep learning.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. If you hear a word or a phrase you don't understand, look it up. Ask a native speaker for help.
Right. Keep those dictionaries handy, folks.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this vocabulary section, I want to emphasize that learning a language is a journey. It's not a destination.
Right.
It takes time and effort, but it's incredibly rewarding.
Well said. And remember, understanding these key terms and phrases is just the first step towards gaining a deeper understanding of how labor law works in the U.S.
Now let's transition back to our discussion about U.S. labor law and explore some fascinating aspects of workplace participation and how it impacts employees' voices and roles.
Okay, workplace participation sounds intriguing. Let's delve into that. Okay, so we've talked a lot about labor laws here in the U.S., but how does the U.S. system compare to labor laws in other parts of the world?
Well, it's important to remember that labor law is deeply connected to a country's history, its culture, its economic system, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach to workers' rights.
Right, so what are some of the key differences that you see when you compare the U.S. system to, say, European countries?
One of the biggest differences is the level of government involvement. In a lot of European countries, you see a much stronger role for the government in setting labor standards, like those minimum leave requirements we talked about earlier.
Right.
In the U.S., those kinds of things are more often left up to negotiation between employers and unions.
So it's more of a decentralized system in the U.S., relying more on this collective bargaining process.
Exactly. And that kind of ties into another key difference, the strength of unions.
Okay.
Historically, unions have played a much more prominent role in European labor relations. In some countries, union membership is very high, and they have a significant influence on government policy.
And in the U.S., union membership has been declining for decades.
That's right. And that decline has implications for worker protections and bargaining power.
Like two different philosophies of how to balance the interests of workers and businesses.
You could say that, yeah, European systems tend to have a stronger emphasis on social safety nets.
Yeah.
Providing more government support for things like healthcare and unemployment benefits.
Which can provide more security for workers, but it can also lead to higher taxes and more government regulation.
Exactly. It's a trade-off. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things the U.S. could learn from other systems.
Okay.
For example, the idea of co-determination, where workers actually have a voice in company decision-making through board representation, is pretty intriguing.
Yeah, that's a level of workplace democracy we don't really see in the U.S.
No, it's more common in countries like Germany. It's a different approach, and it has its own pros and cons.
So there are different models out there, each with its own kind of strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. But regardless of the model, I think the goal should always be to create a system that's fair, just, and sustainable for both workers and businesses.
Well said. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the future of work. I mean, things are changing so rapidly these days with automation, the gig economy, globalization. It's like the whole landscape of work is being reshaped.
It really is. And those changes are bringing both challenges and opportunities for labor law. One of the biggest challenges is how to protect workers' rights in an increasingly automated world.
Right. If robots are taking over jobs, what happens to all those workers who are displaced?
That's the question a lot of people are grappling with. We need to think about things like retraining programs and skills development and strengthening social safety nets to support those workers who are impacted by automation.
And what about all those gig workers out there? The freelancers, the independent contractors, the Uber drivers and the like, they often fall outside the traditional protections of labor law.
That's another big challenge. The gig economy is growing rapidly, but the legal framework hasn't quite caught up. You know, there are questions about how to classify these workers, whether they should be considered employees or independent contractors, and what rights and benefits they should be entitled to.
It's a bit of a Wild West out there.
It can be, and it's something that lawmakers and labor advocates are actively working on to make sure that these workers aren't exploited.
Okay, so lots of challenges, but are there any positive trends emerging from all these changes in the world of work?
I think there are. For example, the rise of remote work and flexible schedules has the potential to create more inclusive and equitable workplaces,
Right.
especially for people with caregiving responsibilities or disabilities.
With like technologies opening up new possibilities for how and where we work.
Exactly. And I think there's also just a growing awareness of the importance of work-life balance and mental health in the workplace.
Nobody wants to burn out or feel like they're constantly tethered to their jobs.
Right. So there are definitely reasons to be optimistic about the future of work.
Okay.
But it will require continued dialogue innovation and a willingness to adapt to the changing needs of both workers and businesses.
Well, Linda, we've covered so much in this deep dive into U.S. labor law. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the main takeaway is that labor law is dynamic, it's evolving, it reflects our values as a society. You know, it's about finding that balance between protecting workers' rights and promoting economic growth.
And it's a reminder that we all have a stake in shaping the future of work, whether you're an employee, an employer, or just someone who cares about fairness and justice. Understanding labor law is essential.
Absolutely. And for our English language learners out there, I hope this deep dive has not only helped you understand the complexities of U.S. labor law, but has also expanded your vocabulary and given you some new insights into American culture and society.
And keep practicing those new terms and phrases, folks. The more you use them, the more confident you'll become.
And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. We've got a whole library of episodes waiting for you.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.